Hey, hello guys.
Hi.
So now that we have finally been to both ecosystems, it's time for us to come to some conclusions, talk about a few things that we weren't able to in those videos, and overall just talk about everything that we did for the project.
So because of our limited resources that we have, we weren't able to research the environment to its full extent. So we weren't able to really come to a conclusion about population size. And also because we only are basing our research off of things that we found online, as well as us physically going there, and we weren't able to exactly see every single tree or every single organism of a specific species, so we're not really able to come to a final conclusion on the population size.
And since we can't really just search up what a population size would be on the internet, because it most likely wouldn't just have that for one environment, that led us to not be able to really identify a carrying capacity for them. However, we do know that a carrying capacity is based upon the density dependent and independent factors, so those are the limiting factors, and so that is what we'll be talking about now. So the carrying capacity we know is the K in the equation for logistic growth, and so that's kind of where on the graph, and so I'll put a picture here, but so here, and so up on the top you can see there's a line where it kind of levels off, where obviously logistic growth will level off, and that is where the carrying capacity line is, and that's basically just saying this is the max the population can get to. So now, density dependent and independent factors.
I'm going to be talking about the density independent factors. So there's many density independent factors within every ecosystem and every environment. So some of them could be the actual climate, the weather, the amount of sunlight specific places receive, and pretty much just anything that the actual environment and the species in the environment don't have any control over. Pretty much they exert their influence on population size regardless of the population's density. And those are just a few examples of density independent factors. It's important to take note still that density independent factors still have an influence on the population and the population size, and whether population or specific species can thrive in that area or not, because a lot of different animals will eventually evolve to fit the density independent factors that are provided in their specific environment, as we learned about from when we talked about Darwin's finches and his theory of evolution. It's also important to take note that if one area receives more sunlight than another, then that might benefit a specific organism but not benefit another organism, so allow one organism to thrive whereas another one actually is adversely affected. And that is pretty much all I have to say about the density independent factors.
So now I'll be talking about the density dependent factors. The density dependent factors mean that a population can only grow so much due to these limiting factors, so such as food would be an example. If the population was to exceed the amount of food that is there for them, obviously a large number of them would die off due to malnourishment and they don't have food. So food limits how many individuals of the species in the population can actually be there. Another density dependent factor would be homes available to them. So there's only so much space and there's only so much kind of shelter for them. For example, in trees, if birds need to build nests, there's only so many branches that are sturdy enough for them to build, or with the right conditions as the independent factors. So the density dependent factors intensify as the species grows. Going back to the food example, as the species grows, the food is going to have to limit how much the species can grow completely. So basically, if there aren't enough basic resources that any species or sort of individual, if you think about it in a human sense, need to live, obviously they can't live. Food, water, and shelter are like the three basic necessities, and so that is what limits how many species of that specific population can live in that area within that ecosystem. So now we'll be talking briefly about biodiversity. So biodiversity the term just relates to how many types of species there are in an area. So how many organisms, plants, animals of all like different sorts.
Yeah.
that fit particular niches. So how different everything is. And
It's pretty much just saying like how much diversity a specific ecosystem has in relation to the amount of species and different species that are in that ecosystem. Throughout this entire project, we obviously did take note and were able to see a bunch of different species and able to understand and see the role that they play in the food chain and the role that they play within their own ecosystems, as well as the different relationships each species has together.
And like just for an example, obviously when we are looking at these smaller food chains, we're not going to look at everything in the entire food web. And so then when we still go into these ecosystems, we're seeing animals such as the turtles, who we didn't initially do research on, or we're seeing other plants and trees that show that there's a ton of biodiversity in the area and there's not just one specific type of tree, and maybe they look alike but they're from different species. So that kind of just shows that despite only looking at the one chain, we were still able to acknowledge all of the biodiversity that these ecosystems have. So now we'll be talking about the hypothetical instances we kind of introduced in the beginning. We touched a lot on the first one, which is basically just the possible disturbances, especially in our McRitchie Reservoir video.
As we said in our McRitchie Reservoir video, how we took note about the disturbances when it came to the plastic that was littered inside of the aquatic area of the rainforest ecosystem.
Also just any ways that humans could disturb the animals, so such as feeding them like foreign substances to them, such as the bread we saw with the tadpoles, and then also just either getting too close to the animals or kind of just interfering with their everyday life.
Just anything that may differ from their natural habitat that humans or anything will cause.
And then the second instance that we didn't really touch on, but we'll talk about now, is what would happen if the keystone species were to leave the environment. So we'll just talk about now what would happen if the keystone species die. So just taking from what we learned in AP Bio, there was a scenario where there was a seal, and then there were the urchins, and then the kelp. When the seals were taken out of the environment, there was an increase in urchins, as obviously the seals were not feeding on the urchins, which then in turn caused a decrease in the amount of kelp in the environment, because the more urchins mean more to feed on the kelp.
It's the double negative regulation.
So in our instances,
so I'm going to take an example from McRitchie Reservoir. So as we talked about, the monitor lizard eats the snakes, and the snakes eat the small amphibians and frogs and smaller lizards. If the monitor lizard was taken out of the equation, then obviously there would be an increase in the snakes, which would then cause a major decline in the population size of small amphibians and of frogs and lizards and pretty much anything that the snake will eat and feed on, because there will be an excess amount of snakes. Okay, so now this pretty much wraps up our entire project and us taking you guys along with us and teaching you guys about the different types of ecosystems that are present in Singapore.
And so we hope that you guys actually got to learn out of this project, and that maybe you now know a little bit more about not only Singapore's ecosystems, but about the terms we talked about, whether that's like apex predator, carrying capacity, density, independent or dependent factors. And we really want to thank you guys for watching, and we hope you enjoyed.
So make sure that you guys can define all of these terms.
And if you can't, that's okay too. Take the time to write down any questions you have, and we'll try and answer them in the comments down below.
Thank you.
Bye.